All right, we have a really packed agenda, so we're going to dive in. We have almost, I think, over 75 people registered for this great event. So I think we'll be collecting quite a few as we move through. But I have the prestigious honor of kicking off this great discussion. I'm Jamie Baxter. I support the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network. We welcome you on behalf of our partners with the Chesapeake Bay Trust and their capacity building initiative to this workshop on participatory grant making. We're really excited to offer this. We're the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network, which is a regional environmental grant makers collaborative, has been doing a lot of learning around anti-racism, around racial equity, and how grant makers are both part of the problem and can be really part of the solution. The Regional Capacity Building Initiative, which is run with the Chesapeake Bay Trust, supports a number of collaboratives at the community level as well as the regional level. Their work is really around building trust and building infrastructure to support collaborative work together. And they also have been very curious and want to know more about how sharing resources and how doing so in a participatory and sort of democratic way can both be a way to support and build trust and collaborative power, but also just get more done. So they're very interested in this topic as well. We're excited to be able to offer this, which is really around building our own awareness of what participatory grant making is about and what it isn't, but also hearing directly from folks working at the community level and at the movement level in our region about how a tool like participatory grant making could really add value and power to their work. So really excited to get started. I'm going to hand it over to Noelle Harden, who is with the University of Minnesota Extension. And she has a really deep knowledge and a vast amount of experience in shared decision-making processes around resources. She came to us initially because she was involved in a project that some of you may recall that some of the foundations in our region supported through the Chesapeake Food Shed Network. And that effort, which was really around connecting leaders who were looking to reform our region's food system to be more equitable and regenerative, they actually helped to form and implement a shared gifting project. And she'll share a little bit about her experience with that as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to Noelle. Glad you're here and take us away.
Hello, everyone. I am absolutely delighted and honored to be with you this afternoon. And I've got a presentation that I will get pulled up here, and someone could let me know if you're seeing my slides. That would be fantastic. Awesome. So as you heard, I'm Noelle Harden. I'm hailing from a different part of the country where we've got a couple feet of snow on the ground and more that's coming down as we speak. But as I'll mention in a moment, I have a connection here with the Chesapeake Bay region, and you all are kind of near and dear to my heart. So just really excited to be here and share what I've learned in about 7 years of experience with participatory grant making. And thank you to anyone who took the time to participate in this personal reflection. This was sent out to you all via email, but if you're seeing it for the first time right now, that's okay too. I would love if a couple of folks, or maybe a lot of folks, would share what came up for you when you were doing this reflection. So if there may be a few words that you want to say in the chat as you were thinking about a role that you've had in a grant making process, whether you applied, whether you were the funder or on a review committee. I love to ask people to think about, how did that experience feel? Did you have any insights through the process or reflections on things that maybe you wish had been a little bit different? And I love for people to think about not just the bad things or the good things, but really what was kind of the full picture. So what were the roses? things that were maybe positive about that experience. Maybe you got the money and that was really exciting. Also, were there any thorns or things that maybe weren't so great about the process? And then lastly, buds, which I think are almost the most important piece, where we think about what are some of the things that we learned or things that we're thinking about maybe doing differently the next time. And I'm just going to take a peek at the chat to see if anyone has anything to share about your reflection. What was that experience like that you thought about or that is coming to your mind now? All right. Well, I always
I can share.
know, yes,
I'll
that'd be great.
share.
Let's jump right
Um,
in.
in my former life, working more on the ground and in communities, I just remember I was always writing grants, and I always found like I always had to kind of bend, my dreams and like what would really work for that community I was working with to like whatever it was, in the RFP.
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes grants can be the tail that wags the dog, so to speak, right? And you have to shift what you really want to do in order to get the money. Absolutely. Jamie, thank you for sharing, says, you always wish there were more resources to support the amazing work out there. Yeah, so sometimes being in that position, especially as a funder or a review committee member, can make us kind of internalize a feeling of scarcity, right? My least favorite part, the application system. My favorite part, it's great to be able to advocate for small and Black-led organizations. As a grantee, always glad to see an easy process. Thank you so much, Melissa, for sharing that. And thank you, Eddie. I had to author a new grant opportunity with inclusion in mind. We had to make decisions about walking the talk, not just talking, or walking the walk, not just talking the talk. Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing. This presentation is going to go pretty quick. I have a lot of content to share. You will get the slides and the recording later. So don't worry if you're not getting everything, but I did really want to make a little bit of space for this participatory piece because that's really what this all is about. All right, so participatory grant making is all about moving decisions around money to the people most affected by the issues. And what I really want to emphasize is that there is no one right way to do this, but it's really about looking at a whole range of strategies. So I first came to learn about participatory grant making in about 2015. We were with an extension trying to learn about work around the country happening to support local and regional food networks. So I am a total network nerd. And this quote from Ken Morse, one of the network leaders we interviewed, really stood out to me. So he described shared gifting as a non-hierarchical, horizontal process to foster rapid innovation through accelerated sharing. And so that really caught my interest as someone, more interested in networks and peer learning than necessarily, the funding piece. I'm not a funder, but the idea of leveraging a grant making process as a network building strategy was a really cool concept to me. So we ended up releasing a whole report and putting forward this idea of thinking about networks the same way that we think about ecosystems. And in that whole analogy, the idea of investing and even investing in different ways, we kind of saw that as the sunshine that powers the work of food networks. So after meeting with Ken, I had the opportunity to get connected with RSF Social Finance, which is a group on the West Coast that has really led the way in leading shared gifting circles, particularly in the context of food and agriculture. So their name, RSF, stands for the Rudolf Steiner Foundation. And there's kind of an interesting connection that Rudolf Steiner, in his way of thinking, led to the field of organic agriculture and also has led to the development of shared gifting in being a strategy that's used around the country and around the world. So kind of an interesting connection between participatory grant making and alternative food systems that can partly be traced back to Rudolf Steiner. So in this whole journey, and in fact, Christy was one of the people that we interviewed in our initial study of statewide food networks. And we really uncovered this kind of shared interest in thinking differently about funding systems, particularly the ways that decisions get made. So a few years ago, you can actually find this on YouTube, which is where I dug this up. But we led a shared gifting simulation where we went through the whole process of shared gifting with no real money attached, but a really powerful way to be able to kind of help people understand what these methods look like in action. So quick shout out to the Chesapeake Food Network and the great work that Christy and Sonia have done around that. So our program today, as far as I know, this is the only participatory grant making program that exists within Extension nationally. And what we do is support values-based grant making and participatory funding models through a range of strategies, everything from direct facilitation and design of different processes to education like we're doing today together. So a little bit of kind of numbers on the growth of this program. And you may have seen our website already that went out with some of the information for today. We have a lot of resources on our website. And I've also sort of evangelized this idea within Extension. And we have a short article as well, where you can kind of read a little bit more about some of our work. So we'll make sure that you get the links for both of those. So what I'm really going to focus on the next 10 minutes or so is what does participatory grant making really look like in action? So I always emphasize that this is not just about the awarding process, although that's probably the most fun part to talk about. But it's really something that can be brought in throughout the life cycle. So we'll walk through each of these 4 areas, starting with the application process. And what I really want to emphasize is there are so many ways to be creative in getting community input, making decisions about what you want to fund, what the goals are, how to structure the funding, how to design the application using accessible language. And I've used a lot of strategies around this. Here's one example where we had a little bit of money to allocate to food networks. And as we were figuring out how to structure that, our program leader in Extension said, well, what are going to be the outcomes of this funding? So instead of trying to answer that ourselves, we just turned it around to the food network leaders themselves to say, let's think about different funding levels and what kinds of outcomes could you achieve at that level of funding. So after that brainstorming happened, they actually voted as a group to decide, how are we going to split up this $10,000 and what will be some of the intended outcomes of these grant dollars. Another great way to emphasize creativity, is to lead by example. I was at a conference recently where there is a session about how we need to burn the box to promote sustainable agriculture. It's not even about going outside the box, it's about burning it altogether. So as I think about maybe some of the boxes that we need to burn in a funding framework, let's talk about the RFP. Is a 20-page RFP written in jargon ever going to be an accessible tool for grant making? So with one of our initiatives, we let people write poems, we let people submit videos for their proposal. And we tried to model that by actually developing promotional tools that matched the kind of applications that we wanted to see. So next is the awarding process. How do you involve the community in making decisions about money? I think about three general approaches that I use in my work. The first strategy is to really look at democracy and the idea that everyone gets a vote. And when we go to the polls in November, no one hands you your voter matrix or requires you to do a voter one-on-one 101 training, right? But the idea is every person gets to cast a vote and they get to do it the way that they want. So this idea of a network or community vote can be used within a defined network of people, which I've done, where anyone in the network can apply for the funding, and then everyone in the network gets to cast a vote to see who gets funded. So a recent example was with the Resilient Moorhead network here in my own town, which is super exciting. And then it also can be done with a broader community effort where it's members of a defined community or region who get to cast a vote on projects that are funded. So there's another example with shovel-ready projects for food and agriculture in Northeast Minnesota. Another sort of general approach that I use is a peer-to-peer support and decision-making process. So this can look like a facilitated consultative approach. So a recent example, I worked with community health centers in North Dakota, where they each got a $40,000 budget. They came together, presented their ideas to one another, and then got feedback from not only the other health centers, but also a panel of peer reviewers who gave them feedback, but also sat down with each project and helped them completely redo their budget. And then lastly, in this same example, there was a pot of pooled money where the three health centers brainstormed and then agreed on what they were going to do with the pooled pot of funding that would benefit their three different communities. There's also a sort of collaborative consensus decision-making process that you can use, where people might brainstorm, what could I do with a small pot of the money individually? What could I do working with one other person for a little more money? And then what could we do as a larger scale or regional project? So very similar approaches there. And really the idea is to get feedback from peers and also to be able to make sort of shared decisions together. All right, and then the last one, which is the most common method that I use of shared gifting. So this is a really cool kind of radical process where all the grantees come together, they pitch their projects to one another, and then they actually act as the grant makers and allocate the funding to one another's projects. So this is the one where we did a simulation with the Chesapeake Food Shed Network, because it can be pretty confusing to imagine what that process looks like without having to sort of experience or observe it directly. But this has been widely used, and I am excited that the North Dakota Department of Health as a state agency was one of the partners that I've been able to work with using this process. And we've also used this within extension, even for making internal program budget decisions around things like professional development. So this can be used not just to grant money externally, but even within an organization. All of these methods could be used actually to make some of those internal budgetary decisions. And so I do get asked, well, what about community review panels? This is not a method that I work with widely through participatory grant making, but I do have some of my own experiences serving on panels that include both university and community reviewers. And I think that these approaches can be a wonderful step. I've also witnessed firsthand that sometimes we invite community members to the table without really thinking about the table and how it's structured, and that, you know, are we really shifting power to community, or are we inviting them to pull up a folding chair to our table? So my thoughts are sometimes you have to get rid of the table altogether. And I think shared gifting is a method that really does that very well. So just quickly, I know we're getting close to time here, but on the implementation side, I can't say enough about continuing to bring people together for additional learning, to be able to troubleshoot things that are coming up with their projects, getting to visit one another's projects in real life. That's a really common request that I hear from grantees who participate in shared gifting and other participatory grant making efforts. And then also practicing community accountability. I think it's really important to say that these methods aren't about tossing oversight and accountability out the window, but it's about thinking, how do we have accountability to one another and to the broader community? This is just a really quick tool that I like to use to think about that sort of two-way street or reciprocity between grantees and community, between funders and community, between funders and grantees. So this was actually something that led to us in Resilient Moorhead making the decision to do participatory grant making. Reciprocal partnership mapping is an awesome tool for networks, even outside of this funding grant making environment. So just make a quick plug for this tool as one to check out. All right, and then everyone's favorite topic of reporting. So how do we share successes with consent and reciprocity with grantees, and then using feedback to improve future grant making? I love to use a tool called ripple effect mapping, where this was a map that was created 1 year after a shared gifting circle, where we brought all the grantees together and asked them to share what was the best part of this experience for you. And then they work in pairs to share these beautiful stories and then report out to the larger group as a map is being created showing all the lovely ripple effects from the projects and from the shared gifting circle. So one thing that was cool about this example is some grantees talked about their project and all the beautiful things that happen with community, while others really identified the shared gifting process itself as the thing that was really their peak experience in the process. And I remember one saying, you know, how powerful it is to be able to give and not just be the receiver in this context. Don't forget to celebrate and have fun. Here's a picture from the same event. And I think so often in this really challenging equity-based or changing the food system work, we forget to just have fun and laugh and celebrate together. So I think that's an incredibly important piece of reporting and taking the time to acknowledge all that has been achieved together. And I do not have my testimonial from Alicia pulled up, but I do have this wonderful quote from my partner, health equity specialist at the North Dakota Department of Health, really reflecting on how they feel that they shouldn't be doing grant making in any other way, and the immense importance of handing over the power to the community in making these decisions. And one thing that she notes in this quote is that we've had grantees want to be a part of this funding application simply because they were excited about the type of process that was using and the opportunity for collaboration and peer-to-peer connection. So apologies, I did not read that full testimonial, but I'll make sure it gets sent out to all of you in the follow-up materials. And that is it. I have some time to take questions now, and I was share a few words with all of you today. So thank you so much.
And Noelle, there were a couple questions in the chat box for you.
Wonderful. All right, so I see Melissa's question first. Thanks for your question, Melissa. Can you talk a bit more about how funders can determine what approach to participatory grant making to take? Awesome question. I love this. So I like to think of participatory grant making as a way to add value, right? Kind of like in agricultural value added producers. So how can we add value to the grant making process? A lot of times grant making is done in kind of a black box, right? The application goes in, the outcome comes back. A lot of times you don't really get much feedback about your project, whether or not you were funded. So I like to talk with funders about, what are some of your goals with the grant making initiative beyond getting money out the door to good projects? For example, are you hoping that grantees might find ways to collaborate across their projects? Are you hoping that community members who felt disenfranchised in the past will be able to access power in a different way? Are you hoping that in the case of Resilient Moorhead, we were trying to get to more collaboration across our network and more opportunities to engage with the broader community? So what are some ways that you can leverage this grant making, decision making process to advance some of those other goals? So I think being really goal oriented and thinking about, what are you hoping to achieve and how can we do that? And then of course, what are the restrictions around the funding? That's not something that we can just ignore, right? But being very aware of what will the reporting requirements be and where are there opportunities to be flexible? Some of the, maybe there might be opportunities to leverage additional sources of funding. That was something that happened with our Northeast Minnesota Shovel Ready Projects initiative. They wanted to have this community facing pitch event where the grantees would talk about each of their projects and the community would vote, and to also be really strategic in having other funders participate in that event. And so one outcome that came from that was they actually were able to leverage additional funding because one of the other funders that attended that was like, hey, one of your projects we can fund right now. you don't need to use your funding for this one. And so you can look at maybe, funding another project that you wouldn't have been able to, or fully funding a project that would have just gotten partial funding. So hopefully that answered your question, Melissa. It's such a great question. Okie dokie. So Vanessa says, with the example of applicants meeting, pitching, and allocating the funds among themselves, did the applicants appreciate / enjoy the process, or did it actually create extra work for already busy nonprofits? Love this question. So yeah, the Action Learning Seed Fund example where I had written the promotional poem, we really wrestled with that because we were asking applicants to not include a specific budget, right? Because people grant money across the circle and no one gets exactly what they ask for. And we also wanted people to spend 4 hours on Zoom participating in the gifting circle. So we felt it was really important to set expectations that we want you to focus your time on the gifting circle and not writing a giant grant proposal. So we told people in the invitation to apply, not the RFP, to spend 3 hours or less on your proposal. Because we wanted them to understand, we're going to ask you to spend your time elsewhere in this application and pitching process. So I think just being really clear on, this is where we don't want you to spend your time, and this is where we do want you to spend your time. That can help kind of manage those expectations. Our second shared gifting circle with the North Dakota Department of Health, we had someone, a grad student, who was in that room at the beginning of the day and then came back into the room at the end of the day. And she was absolutely blown away. She said, the vibe in here is completely different from the beginning to the end of the day. So before the circle, people were nervous. I even heard stuff like, I thought this was going to be like Shark Tank, the show Shark Tank, really scary, really competitive. But then by the end of the circle, people have shared usually some pretty powerful stories with one another. People were exchanging hugs. People were exchanging cell phone numbers. We had to kick people out of the room an hour after the event ended because they still were talking with their new friends that they had made. And so I think the shift from a really competitive, not transparent approach to grant making to something that's very, transparent and collaborative is something that can happen, simply over the course of a shared gifting circle. So really great question. Thank you, Vanessa. Okie dokie. Let's see. Oh, hi, Christy Sade. I didn't know you were going to be here. Hello. And Christy, I don't think that you have a question, but you shared an awesome resource. Christy is another fabulous person to connect with about participatory grant making. So anything that she has shared, I highly recommend checking out. Thanks for that, Christy. Okay, and Bianca, we do this in Collective 365. We launched on Juneteenth. Very cool. Check out that example from Bianca. And Jamie has a question. Varied approaches to identifying community members to participate in a decision-making process. I'm sure this depends on many factors, but can you share best practices for this important step? Yes, I love that. Who is a community champion or knows a community champion who gets asked to do everything and to be on every committee and every board, and they're really tired? I can think of several. So I think that, again, I kind of go back to the definition of participatory grant making and how do we involve those who are most affected by the issue. So I think, and I've been guilty of kind of turning to those who are like our widely tapped key informants. But I think you can still do that, but go a step further and say, like, who's an emerging leader or someone that you started mentoring? And could we invite that person to be a part of this experience? I'm working with a county in Minnesota around opioid settlement funding that's coming to our state. And, they felt it was really important with the opioid issue to really look at those with direct lived experience. So they narrowed their decision-making body and who they want to invite to the table to those who have directly experienced or are actively experiencing substance use disorder. So I think that there's, a lot of considerations that they've had in trying to get that messaging right and reach out to that part of the community. But I think, being clear on who you identify as being most affected by the issue, and then being thoughtful, working with service providers and folks who work directly with that population to think about how can we reach them, and being very inclusive in that case, being very clear about confidentiality and some of the parameters around how they'll engage and how their information will or won't be shared. So I hope that kind of answers your question. And I imagine that our fantastic panelists coming up will have some other thoughts around that issue as well.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Noelle, for that really wonderful presentation. And I know earlier you said you were going to be able to stay on a little bit after the end if people wanted to follow up more or talk more to you about some of their questions. So I appreciate you kicking us off here. Now I have the distinct privilege of introducing this panel. We have 4 wonderful panelists to really talk about participatory grant making and what it might look like in the Chesapeake region, more specifically, and what that could mean for our community, and also talk about the need. I like to think of grant making as more of an art than a science. And I think we can all agree that the world is richer to have a variety of artists, and some of the best coming on now are panelists. So I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves. We have Dr. Sacoby Wilson, Akiima Price, Vernice Miller-Travis, and Melissa Sines. We'll have Vernice. Do you want to introduce yourself and also tell us why you wanted to be on this panel?
Sure. My name is Vernice Miller-Price, Vernice Miller-Travis. Thank you very much. And I wanted to be on this panel because I think it is a great conversation for the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network and its partners to be seeding across the network and across our region. And it is an opportunity that a lot of funders are starting to think about different ways to be in partnership with folks to move resources. So, and Jamie and Casey told me I needed to be here.
Thank you, Vernice. Dr. Wilson, do you want to say hi to everybody?
Hey, everybody. Yes, sorry I wasn't on earlier. I had a call with my funder, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is relevant to this conversation, because we were recently funded $2.2 million to start the Mid-Atlantic Climate Action Hub. And so as part of the Mid-Atlantic Climate Action Hub, we are providing technical assistance and financial assistance to communities on the front line, fence line, dealing with environmental climate justice issues. And we have hubs in Philadelphia, the Overbrook Center. We have South Baltimore Community Land Trust in Baltimore, Central de Apoyo Familiar in Prince George's County, the DC EJ Coalition in DC. We also have a group from Virginia, and we have Sesh and Shin. I'm not going to spell them out, but groups are working on chicken farms in the Eastern Shore. And so part of that project, we have a pass-through component of that project to give away half the money to community groups within the region. So I think it's an opportunity for this group to potentially partner with Match to help us work with these hubs to get monies out to these hard to reach communities and those who are, really at the front line of environmental and climate justice issues. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Akiima, you're next on my screen.
All right, thank you for the opportunity. I'm both Casey and Jamie, and anytime Jamie asks me to do something, it's not more likely going to do it because I have so much respect for the work that Jamie's been doing to just even evolve the thinking and efforts of funders to be more innovative, because usually we dance to you, and now it feels like funders are starting to dance to us, which is where I think the answer is. My background, I do like something called meaningful park engagement, which is like the intersection of like social work and in traditional environmentalism, but using park-based settings to specifically think about and address physical, mental, and social wellness in parks that are already populated. So I was able to help co-found the Friends of Anacostia Park, which is a historically African-American used park. It's not a non-traditional national park, but it is a national park. It doesn't get the same kind of resources and love per se. So the need for a Friends group has been around for a long time. So I'm really glad we've been finally able to stand that up. And, you know, a lot of what we do is participatory development, because we're talking to case managers and social workers and community members. And we are really trying to build on the backs of the expertise, like community expertise, right? And so this participatory grant making process is new to me, but it makes all kind of sense. And so I'm glad to be here to provide any kind of insight to help further inform this happening in this group. So thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. And Melissa.
Hi, everyone. So great to be here with you all today. My name is Melissa Sines. I am work with Colmena Consulting. And so right now we're working, us and ComWaters are working with the diversity work group at CVP to develop and deliver workshops for both funders and nonprofits, particularly under-resourced nonprofits, on how grant makers can implement more equitable grant making practices. And so as part of that process, we got a chance to talk to representatives from under-resourced organizations, from funding institutions, kind of across the spectrum. So we were talking to federal and state folks, local counties and municipalities and private funders. And we heard a lot of commonality around what were some of those barriers that both sides were seeing as it related to funding in under-resourced communities, right? And so I named one earlier, there's extensive application and reporting processes, you know, kind of this like lack of kind of awareness and outreach on both sides, right? Like we're like, who is this on that side and who's that on that side, right? Some requirements around match or reimbursement grants. And I think at its base, there's a lot of, you know, kind of mismatch around the language that funders and communities are using to talk about the same kinds of things. Funders may be more focused on science outcomes, communities may be more focused on holistic community outcomes. And so in that work, one of the potential solutions that was named was participatory grant making. But I think a lot of funders have recognized that there's a lot of learning to do in this area. And so whenever I got the invite to come over and support this call, I was glad to come over and share some of the intelligence that we've gathered to help support this conversation. So great to be here with you all.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. So we have a few questions ready for our panelists. I'll hand it over to one to kick us off, and then if any of the other folks on the panel want to weigh in, please do so. And while we're having this conversation, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We have some time blocked off for that as well. So the first question, we'll start with Vernice. Why do you think there's this increased discussion and momentum for participatory grant making these days?
Well, I think people are looking for different and new ways to engage around philanthropy. Philanthropy has gotten a very serious critique of the ways that systemic racism and classism and gender-based discrimination and how one thinks about certain populations and how that factors into decision-making around grant making, how we take those visions around how we think about certain people in certain communities and then establish criteria for grant making. And all of that has been challenged in a very, very fundamental way. Some folks in the philanthropic circle just keep doing what they're doing and have the impacts that they have, but some want to really examine what is at the foundation of their theories and premises around grant making. Why are we doing this? And we have seen certainly in the last 20 years since I was at the Ford Foundation, a real shift to philanthropy having to take on more of the role of meeting community needs, because so much of what used to be the social safety net has been disempowered or disemboweled or disregarded, or any of those other dis words, right? Just who's going to help communities? And so how do we think about charity? We used to have one set of views around charity in the 20th century, but in the 21st century, we are tasked to come up with different views and different values of why we do what we do, not because people are less than or because they can't think more expansively about how to meet their own needs, but because the intersecting challenges that are facing communities, particularly certain communities and certain populations, are more than an individual can surmount. And so what do we do, within the philanthropic community to meet those needs? And in so doing those kinds of examinations, how do we think about different kinds of models to meet that need, right? So we used to have one model, and that one model was two models. There's a corporation. The corporation has a philanthropic arm. The philanthropic arm gives out money, right? And or they're wealthy folks, and those wealthy folks aggregate their wealth to some extent, set some aside, and then they do grant making based on that. And those were our two dominant philanthropic models. And now we have this participatory grant making model that has come into the space and has challenged the dogma around how we think about philanthropy, how we think about charity. And charity is not necessarily about giving to those who don't have or can't do for themselves. It's also about doing good work with resources that you have, but can be invested in other places to do other things with and for other people. And so participatory grant making is about how we set the table for who makes the decisions about what it is we're trying to do with those grant making resources, those philanthropic dollars, and who makes the decisions about where they go. And the decisions to be democratized cannot be just about the people who hold on to wealth and money, but also the people who want to have impact. And that now we want to be sitting at the table with people who can advise us on how to have the most impact, the most transformative impact with the investments that we make. And that's not always the people who hold on to the financial resources, right? And that's what participatory grant making is teaching us and showing us. There's lots of value. And there's lots of value, lots of creative thinking, lots of transformational thinking. And it's not just held by people who have money. In fact, I would argue it's really not held by people who have money. It's held by those who know what it means to struggle, those who know what it means to meet need where there's so very little resource, and how to be creative and how to do that. And so now we're setting different tables and we're sitting shoulder to shoulder. And I would just close with this. When I worked at the Ford Foundation, I had a very, very clear memory of being a grantee of the Ford Foundation for many, many years in the nonprofit world that I spent most of my career. And one day I was going with a dear, dear colleague of mine, the Honorable Margaret Carey McRae, who led the Southern office, the Mississippi office of the Center for Constitutional Rights. I worked in the New York office. She worked in the Greenville, Mississippi office. And we were going to ask for a grant to support her voting rights work. And we stood on the corner of 43rd Street and 2nd Avenue, about 1,000 yards away from the front entrance door to the Ford Foundation. And we held hands and we prayed to God with all the traffic going by us, all the buses, all the people walking by, all the bustle. And we literally prayed to God that we would not say anything about the ultra left work that we were doing at the Center for Constitutional Rights that would make the Ford Foundation not want to give us this grant to do this really great voting rights work that she was doing in the Mississippi Delta. And I promised myself that I would never, ever, ever make people who came to see me at the Ford Foundation feel like that, like they were coming to visit the heavens, or going up in the elevator would be like going up to heaven. And is God's right hand, me, the program officer, going to grant them their wish to give them some money? That is just such an ass backwards way to think about philanthropy. And so I tried never to do that. And I love the whole notion of participatory grant making to get us to think differently about philanthropy and our role in it and who can be philanthropists.
Wow, that was wonderful. Really knocked that one out of the park. I don't know if panelists, if you want to add anything more, or Vernice, I think I've seen.
I think she covered it. I think she covered it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, that was.
I'll add a quick thing. It's hard to go after my icon, Vernice, my neighbor, Vernice. Just want to say that when it comes to, and I didn't say this earlier about my introduction and the connection, in the space I'm in academia, when it comes to these issues that we're trying to address, it's the same. Whether it's academia, the environmental movement, or philanthropy. You know, the lack of engagement, the lack of investment, the lack of diversity, lack of equity, lack of inclusion. It's been the same for me, my experience. So in my work, just to kind of give a different angle, I do community-based participatory research because of the traditional system in academia of an extractive system. You have an extractive economy you can apply to what's happening in the environmental movement. You have an extractive economy of racial capitalism when you can even apply to philanthropy and how we've done investments, right? And so that undertone, that undercurrent is there, whether it be in academia, whether it be the environmental movement, or whether it be in philanthropy. So you see the same parallels, right? So we want to see representative justice, you know, CBPR, community-based research, communities engage in all stages of the research process. Participate in philanthropy, communities engage in all stages of the philanthropic process. I can say, get that forcible word out. You know what I'm saying? So we want to have the same approach, right? Those contextual experts have to be at the table. And you think about the environmental justice movement, right? You talk about the differential burden of hazards, et cetera, right? Part of the history of it is not just differential burden of hazards, but the folks who are most impacted not being at the decision-making table. So that representative justice is very important, and it helps us with the distributional justice. So, you know, I mentioned earlier, you know, we have this new hub, but we're in some ways doing some grant making. Now, I'm not a grant making expert, but would love to partner with folks, but we are focused in on those who are the contextual experts. So we need to uplift that community knowledge, that cultural and community knowledge systems, right? That needs to be brought into the grant making process. And you know, it needs to be of the community, for the community, and by the community, whether it be research, whether it be an environmental movement, or whether it be philanthropy. So I just want to, you know, make that point, and I'll stop talking to Vernice. I didn't want to Sacoby explain what Vernice said because I can't ever do that, but just want to add my own academic angle to it. So I'll pass the mic back.
Great, thank you. And for the end there, Sacoby, you were talking about community, and I was wondering if Akiima, you could talk about, you know, what this might mean to the community and with your work with Anacostia Park and Community Collaborative and Friends of Anacostia Park.
Sure. First, I'd like to preface that I've been doing work in Anacostia since like the late 90s. And so there's been a lot of momentum growing the entire time. And a lot of these original dollars were not around this type of innovation. A lot of it was around development, and the community engagement was like, what do you want to see, knowing that they're about to build this stadium? Is it really about what they want to see, or this performative kind of thing that always goes around, you know, in these neighborhoods around these areas that become built up? And so it was because of the innovation that we've been able to get to this point. So that's what that means for me, is the continued necessary innovation to really dismantle some of this previous thinking around even what environmental means. Like, you know, a lot of what I say, you know, environment is the living and non-living things that make up your immediate surroundings. And so when I was an environmental educator and I wanted to talk about crack as an environmental issue, I was shut down because it was like, well, that doesn't fit trees and grass, butterflies and birds and frogs. And I'm like, okay. So what this does is to continue to fund and allow for the work to be truly informed by what's needed on the ground, right? Because again, that's another place I've always tried to be at, is at this intersection of how do you frame community needs through environmental, like traditional, like physical environmental assets. So how do you leverage a park with issues around crime and employment, but then also the vice versa, how do you leverage the community expertise with some of the park issues? And so that's what we're doing with the Friends group. Like I would not go out and ask them, because so the park, the area around the park I work in is Ward 7 and 8, primarily Ward 7 and 8, not the new lines. But the majority of these audiences are, you know, low income, economically stressed. The last thing we're going to do is ask you to help fundraise for federal money for federal dollars to do things on the ground in a federal park, right? That's crazy. So what we've been doing is kind of leveraging the human and social capital, and again, expertise of these folks to kind of inform what are the things we're doing. At the same time, yes, we do still have to focus on the traditional infrastructure and so forth. But what this innovation also breeds is newer partners with different dollars. Like all of our dollars don't have to be green. We qualify for justice money because we're employing people who are just coming home. And we're also, another word I think we're dismantling is stewardship, because stewardship has always been wrapped around the idea of picking up trash and things of that nature, whereas stewardship is exerting care. And the audiences we worked with, one, have never really owned anything. Two, in some cases, how people spend their free time. We just make this assumption that because you got free time and you're unemployed, you should volunteer your time. So I mean, it's just all these opportunities that came out of me being able to be innovative and not having to follow suit of some previous concepts around what park friends development had to look like and what stewardship and conservation has to look like. And so I'm elated at just the possibilities, because while I've innovated and had ideas, in the last 30 years of my life, now we're coming into even bigger ideas, right? Because there's so many other people out there, and it changes when you have case managers at the table, when you have, policy folks at the table, when you have justice folks at the table, when you have health folks at the table, your program is going to be so much more relevant to those folks that you're really trying to reach versus, someone who is an expert on planting trees. And again, not saying that there's not a seat for all of them at the table, but if we don't have the freedom to innovate around what's necessary and not what we've been told we have to do to dance for these dollars, it changes the game. And I've seen that just in the development of the Friends of Anacostia Park, like just even in the way the model was formed. Like when the word innovation was in my original contract, which I was so grateful for, because what I could not do is come in and repeat this same sort of, again, typical traditional model of what friends groups do, because we are not a traditional friends group at all. And so I guess bottom line, again, I'll say it, that this freedom allows the innovation necessary to really make this work relevant, which truly makes it sustainable, because people aren't just doing it for the Earth Month, and they're not just doing it for a $25 gift card to Walmart. They're doing it because they see themselves in it. And just what it means for people to eat, like sometimes this money seems so like you were saying, kind of, Vernice, like it's in this big heavens and I got to dance for this and I got to pray for this and fast for this. When you erase that and people can really,
Yes.
the trust that you get from the community when they see this, and when you're not holding the money like this, but instead, like, again, like that shifts mindsets, that shifts practices. And again, I can't speak enough of the value of that innovation, because that to me is what it's going to take to dismantle and really recreate what this work really looks like.
Here.
Thanks, Akiima. And Sacoby, you talked about layering different efforts and philanthropic and other sources of funding. Can you talk a little bit more about participatory grant making can support or complement existing work in the region to build power and the movement of environmental justice?
I mean, I was on my call with Robert Johnson Foundation, and I was talking about, my spidey sense was going off in a positive way. I was getting so excited because part of the problem is, y'all, you see the movement for environmental justice, all of a sudden it's all this funding, we got drinking from one water hose, right? It's not one water hose, it's like 3 to 5 water hoses at one time. It's a lot of money, like the most money for EJ in the history of EJ, right? Vernice, in this year,
not coming from the philanthropic sector, I might add, is where that money is coming from.
Coming from the federal sector, right? The most money in the history of EJ. You say, the movement's been around with Vernice's work, you go to the Warren County PCB landfill fight, right? So 40 years, right? Let's just say 40 years on average. Most money ever in 1 year. That's a lot of money to deal with. I am running around doing grant writing workshops. I got office hours at Wednesday nights right on my calendar, 6 to 8. Just show up so I can help you, coach you to your grant proposal, right? But what we're trying to do in the region, for example, let me just slow down because I'm getting excited. I know I talk fast. I'm from Mississippi. I'm actually in Mississippi right now at home doing some stuff, but that's my joke. I talk fast, but Mississippians, joke, don't talk fast. But I'll get back to my points. So the issue is, within the region, we had this newly funded Robert Wood Johnson grant, right? The Environmental Finance Center, who some of you may engage with, Director Cotting, doing a lot of work around infrastructure, sewer and water infrastructure. They just got 2 grants funded in August from the EPA. One was it wasn't funded at the max amount. So their core funding was funded, right? We have a grant, P30, NIH grant from Hopkins has a newly funded NIH P30 Center grant to provide science support for communities who are dealing with environmental health issues with a focus on environmental justice in the Mid-Atlantic. So you have, that center is called Charmed. So you have Charmed, you have Match, and you have the 2 EFC grants, okay? And then with Charmed, what we're doing is I'm the co-director of the community, the academic co-director of the Community Engagement Corps with Dr. Chris Haney at Hopkins. And then we have 2 community co-directors, Shoshonda Campbell, who y'all know with South Baltimore Community Land Trust, and also Wakiria Poole with Central to Polia Familiar. And so you hear some overlap because Shoshonda and Wakiria also hub leaders on Match. Now, we have worked to submit additional proposals because all the funding is coming down from the federal government with the National Wildlife Federation. So we submitted a EPA technical, Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center grant in October. We submitted for the DOT HUD Technical Assistance Center opportunity. We just submitted 2 weeks ago a proposal for a technical assistance center on brownfields in the Mid-Atlantic, okay? And so we are well positioned because of our current funding from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Charm and EFC funding. And I have funding from Meta, I have funding from the Yellow Chair Foundation, and I also have funding from the Bezos Earth Fund. I have funding from another funder, but I'm not sure it's supposed to be anonymous, so I won't mention them. It's not a bad thing, I think it's supposed to be anonymous. So I have other funding from national funders too. So corporate gifts and foundation gifts. And we are now applying, I'll stop talking because there's a lot of stuff out there. We are now applying for a new funding opportunity, which is really, really relevant for this group on this call. There's an EPA grant makers opportunity. So just in the same way that National Fish and Wildlife is a pass-through, EPA has a $550 million pass-through opportunity to fund 11 pass-throughs at $50 million each for the whole country. We are going to apply to be the pass-through for Region 3. That just came out this week.
But it would be really great if there was some philanthropic partners that were a part of that team who have that expertise and can help get that money on the street more quickly.
And also to throw a little bit of some matching in. So we got the 50 million and we created an EJ fund for the Mid-Atlantic where the philanthropic partners on this call and others can add to that 50. That would be the vision, right? So I'll stop. There's other funds out there, but y'all, there's a lot of money. We have so let me just say this, I'll pass the mic. As part of Match, we're creating a resource, a microsite that's going to have all these grant opportunities on the calendar. And so we have that. Well, we had climate pollution grants that are coming out from federal government. Y'all saw 2 weeks ago, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, $27 billion announcement. Those RFPs are going to come out this summer. We're going to be doing a lot of training and workshops for community groups to apply for those dollars too. So those would be opportunities for, as related to participatory grant making. There's also a thought about how you can come on board and also help with matching, stacking, and layering. It's really important in this moment because we need sustainability and durability to go along with this billions of dollars that are given out in 1 year or 2 or 3, it's 3 years. What do we do post 3 years? So I'll stop. I know I probably said more, but I'll stop and pass the mic.
No, that was great and a great transition also to the next question I had for Melissa in terms of creating sustainable change and what sort of advice you have for folks who work in traditional philanthropy or might be participating in as a grant maker for the first time. What should folks be thinking about as they move forward and work towards change?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't want to throw water on all of this excitement, but I do think that there are some potential pitfalls, particularly when it comes to participatory grant making as it relates to traditional grant makers, right? So we've already talked about today, all of these opportunities for nonprofits or communities to get involved in grant making from the at the strategy level as a grant maker is setting their strategy, in planning for a new grant or initiative, in participating in the actual decision making, in supporting learning and participatory learning or research together, and then also how grant makers can align with their nonprofit partners to take on that systems level work. So there's a lot of levels that grant makers can choose to engage with their nonprofit partners and communities. And so it sounds great, let's just involve them in everything, right? But at the end of the day, we know that ask for participation is an ask for time from organizations often working with scarce resources to tackle tackle tough challenges. And so like, I want to just like say out front and ask for time from a funder without a reciprocal payment for that time is a power play. I just want to point out, you know, in my own career, as I made the shift from nonprofit work to philanthropic work, I saw my quality of life expand exponentially, right? And so when you look at salary surveys around what a program director at a nonprofit is getting paid versus what a program officer at a funder is getting paid, it's a good $50,000 to $100,000 delta there. So, you know, when we're asking folks to come in and support our work as grant makers, we should not be asking them to do it for free. I think that, you know, so you have to be careful what you're asking for, and you don't want to ask for the moon. I think another potential pitfall is when it kind of comes down to defining, like, how are you defining community? Oftentimes grant makers use their nonprofit partners as a proxy for community, right? So instead of, you know, kind of going out into the world and engaging community members, they're like, oh, are the leaders of these, you know, community nonprofits, that's who we want to engage, right? And so with some potential pitfalls there, there's often, you know, some missing perspectives if you're not bringing folks to the table who have never applied for funding before or who have never funded before, right? So you can miss perspectives there. We also know nonprofit leadership is skewed. You know, I think Board Source regularly reports, you know, never more than like 15-ish% of nonprofits nationwide being led by people of color, right? And so leaning on those leaders will lead to a less diverse pool as well. There's also lots of ways that implicit bias can show up in grant making, right? We know that as humans, we are more likely to trust people who look like us, act like us, sound like us, right? And so as we're coming together to make these kind of decisions, I think that it's nice to be like, everybody gets to vote however they want, but at the end of the day, I always recommend a nice little like base training on implicit bias and how to prevent that when you're making decisions. I think there's also like, you know, those existing power dynamics, right? Where the relationship is like, we fund and you implement. There's, you know, nonprofits, whenever they're asked to come into room with funders, often are not sharing real truths and authentic truths about their work because they fear they may be penalized, right? And so you always have to recognize when you're in a mixed crowd like that, how those power dynamics may show up. And then at the end of the day, too often funders are looking for, you know, short-term, they make a short-term commitment and expect really fast results. And if anybody on the call, most of us at this point have in our organizations been engaged in, you know, internal work as it relates to racial equity and DEIJ, and it's tough long-term work. And so we can't expect a year's worth of funding to help make a difference between how an organization is working in community, right? You know, I'd also just kind of like to note, like, we've been talking a lot today about centering those most impacted. And so I don't think that, I want to draw a line here between types of funders. I don't think that it is you know, the role of private philanthropy to be doing an in-run around their nonprofit partners to engage directly in the community, right? I think that we recommend adding folks with lived experience in paid institutional roles in private philanthropy. Alternatively, for those who are, say, maybe in a community foundation, a public charity grant maker, or government funders who are using public dollars, then it does make sense to, you know, kind of go beyond that nonprofit partner as proxy and engage with folks in the community. And so I just want to make kind of a clear line there around like, who should you be thinking about, right? I'd also like to flag like the idea of like culturally responsive participatory grant making. Noelle, I love the the example that you shared around voting and, you know, all of that, but I've also heard about where that has gone really wrong when a funding partner tried to implement that in an Indigenous community, because democratic voting is not the way that they make decisions together. It's not the norm for them. And so it totally mismatched like trust between that grant maker and that community that they then had to go back and repair, right? And so my advice for folks, as you're thinking about that approach to participatory grant making, like ask your community how they want to be involved and what ways they want to make decisions together. I think my last flag here is that, you know, we all know that traditionally most funding institutions are set up as very hierarchical organizations where power is concentrated at the top. You know, I've done a lot of work in the past with folks at the grants management or technology or administration level at funding organizations. And even within funding institutions, they feel very disempowered as it relates to decision making, right? And so for me, it's really important for a funder to look inside, like check your gut, check your values, and check how you're distributing power internally and practicing for sharing and distributing decision making, right? Because it's not going to come off right to your staff or to the people in your community if you as an institution are still concentrating all of your decision making at the top, but you have this one little piece where you're like, okay, you all can make a decision here, right? So really thinking about like, how are we structuring decision making internally, and how are we sharing decision making internally, and how might a shift in that actually shift our culture to be less hierarchical or less traditional in the way that we operate. But I think that, like, given all of this, there's some, you know, great strategies that can help grant makers build the relationships that they need in order to enter into a participatory grant making relationship with authenticity, right? So one is transparency. And Noelle, you said this right off of the top, right? Like really being clear about what the expectations are around who's going to own the data, how the data will be shared, how decisions will be made, what's the extent or the boundary of the decision making that any participatory body has, right? Oftentimes they say participatory grant making, but it's actually just a recommendation, right? The board may hold that final decision making, right? So being clear about that from the top. So transparency is really important. I think the second thing is like building skills and knowledge around community engagement, right? Like it's a whole different skill set than a maybe traditional program officer might have. Oftentimes program officers are brought into a funding institution because of their, you know, kind of level of expertise at a PhD or a master's level on a specific issue or topic, right? But they don't have the people skills necessary to engage with community authentically. And so there's an opportunity for funders to work on building their people skills and their engagement skills. And so there's like, it's like, you've got the hard skills, now let's move into these people skills, just as important in this work. And then finally, I think the last thing is for a funder entering into this is really thinking about your credibility and alignment for these issues, right? Because if you don't have a value statement that centers equity, or if you don't have a value statement that says we share decision making, or if you are not aligned with the movement around environmental justice, right, then maybe this isn't the space for you, right? And so again, it's really thinking about that internal work, and are you ready to kind of step out and be credible and aligned with communities as it relates to your ability to be an actor in this space, right? And so I would just say, like, I'll stop there, but I think that there's a lot of ways to approach this work that can be, that represent pitfalls, and so that's why I think it's very important for grant makers, funders, as they start to think about how they approach this, that they may need to admit to and do some internal work along with, don't wait, don't sit and navel gaze, but along with the work that you're doing in community.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for laying out the pitfalls and also reasons for optimism and towards change. We got one question in the chat. I might try to reword it a little bit. Would folks want to talk about how smaller private foundations can sort of fit into this picture when we're talking about such large sums of federal funding, and what that can mean towards a movement, even if the grant that a private foundation like I'll Fund isn't going to match the size of an EPA grant?
Well, one thing you can help folks with is the match, right? Some of these grants are requiring a match. And though people are trying to engage EPA and the Biden administration and others in a conversation about relaxing that, that's not going to happen. Let's just be straight up. There may be some reduction in the percentage of the match, but in order for people to be able to qualify for many of those grants, particularly at the local government level, they're going to have to come up with a financial match. Can these smaller foundations that are part of the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network help them organize that financing, help them identify other resources? Can you work with the Rural Community Assistance Program that I first met through the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network? Can you work with them to leverage some other sources of capital so that people can meet that match? If they can't get in the room, right? If they can't come up with that match, they can't get in the conversation. And so we don't want people excluded from day one from what is an unprecedented opportunity of federal resources because they can't get in at the most basic level, they can't get in the door. So that's one thing. If there's a way to think creatively about how to leverage the funding that does exist within the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network and all of your various partners to help them meet that match for the federal grants, that would be a great thing. The other thing is grants management. So this is the thing that I remember as the biggest source of stress for me as a program officer at the Ford Foundation. You know, I had come from this field, from the environmental justice movement, had been there from day one, knew all these organizations, not all of them, but a great deal of them were partners and friends and colleagues that I had worked with for decades. And I was shocked, absolutely shocked at the number of organizations that had been around for a really long time that had fiscal sponsors, that did not have their own 501c3s, that did not manage their finances themselves, but had other people do it for them. And there's lots of good reasons for that. But if you want to be in this game, ain't nobody pulling down any of this money that, one, does not have a 501c3, and two, does not have a really good track record of grants management, whether it's non-federal grants management, state resources, tribal resources, whatever. But fiscal grants management, and you all know, federal grants management is a different animal than other philanthropic sources of grants management. But nonetheless, people need to be trained, and I mean rigorously trained. So there were just so many groups that I could not give money to. And I'm going to tell you, you would think, and you all know this, it's a great thing and a great position to be in, to be able to give money away to people who really need it, who are doing transformational work. But there were so many people that I couldn't even consider, so many groups that I couldn't even consider because they didn't have the most basic and rudimentary financial management systems in place, right? Like no annual audited financial audit. That's not going to fly, right? No audit committee. That's not going to fly. No regular process for reviewing externally your financial and fiscal systems. That's not going to work. And God help them if they receive that money and they make one error in how they manage that money, that could ruin a nonprofit organization. I've seen it happen. It was the most difficult decisions I had to make were not about who to give the money to, but who I couldn't give money to because they didn't have the most basic financial management systems in place. That is going to increase hundredfold with the kind of money that the federal government is moving and what they're talking about. What we don't want to see happen is that there's a resegregation of who gets resources and who does not, because smaller organizations do not have the wherewithal to be able to manage the kind of money or even partner with folk. And so, Sacoby, the one challenge I have about all the great work, and it's not a challenge about you and your vision, it's just a challenge about working with academic institutions who are taking 40% off the top. Hell, my alma mater, Columbia University, who partners all the time with the nonprofit that I'm the co-founder of, We Act for Environmental Justice, they are taking 60%. What the hell? You know, why am I giving 60% to you? You're an endowed institution. You got lots of money. You pay all these people big time salaries. Why is our nonprofit going to give you 60% off the top for a grant that we've worked so hard to raise? And it's our credibility from which the money is coming, right? So my position for We Act is bump that. You know, I love the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. They have done tremendous work with us and really done some life-changing work, but I'm not giving you 60%. And so what is the option, right? We need to rethink a lot of paradigms. And I'm just really worried that even though there's so much unprecedented money on the table right now, the people who need it most are not going to be able to get in the door. So what can the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network do to democratize that process, to train people, to provide some of your staff, to provide expertise and training to these folks on the ground? How can we train people to really understand the game? And I'm just going to say this straight up. This is not the moment to be talking about, well, we want a different kind of funding. I'm sure you do, but it ain't coming from the federal government, right? So if you want this money, you have to follow this process that is tried and true and established. And what you cannot do is miscalculate or in any way use that money that is not in alignment with what the federal government is asking you to do. They're making it up as they go along. Trust me, they're my client. They're making this stuff up as they go along. They don't know what they're doing. They just know they got to get this money out the door. But let's help them. You know what you're doing. You've been doing it for a long time in the Chesapeake Bay region. Let's help them figure out how to really grow the capacity of groups in the Chesapeake Bay region, in the Mid-Atlantic region. And let's partner with those organizations to make sure that they can step up to the plate and that they can get the investment that they so richly deserve. But I am very worried about where this money is going to land, who's going to get it, and who's not going to get it.
Yeah, let me add to what Vernice said real quickly. So yes, I'm with you with universities. The great thing about my Robert Wood Johnson grant is a 10% cap on the IDCs. The great thing about the Grantmakers opportunity, a lot of the monies that are coming out from the EPA, for those, I was on NEJAC for some years, Vernice was as well. So we actually put a lot of stuff in. So they're putting caps on the IDCs, the indirect cost rate, the overhead, like 10%. In some cases, I think 5%. I think it was 5% on the Brownfields grant, which I love. 5%. The university's like, where's our money at? That's the problem. You're looking for handouts. Let me leave that alone. And then the Grantmakers one, 80% of the dollars, 80% of the $50 million has to go to communities. 80%, a minimum 80%. So there are things that have been put in place to actually put a cap on the mafioso payola that our institutions have been getting away with for years. That's that extractive economy. That's that pain pimping that's been happening with universities, and we need to stop it. So I'm all on board with that. And I think as Vernice is saying, you know, y'all have the expertise in the region. So I'm looking for this hub, for example, to be a node, a core for what we're doing in the region. I'm happy to collaborate with folks on this call to pull these visions together. And like Vernice said, that grant, even with what we're doing now with the grant management side, that's a huge part of the issue. And having your expertise at the table. I mean, we've had meetings with Adam Ortiz, Region 3 Director of EPA, right? Y'all should be part of those meetings as it relates to how the dollars are coming down and how you can be a service, serve the folks in this region through your infrastructure and your expertise, right? And that's different than the conversation we're having, but that's how you can be the stewardship, being the servant to the people, providing a service, empowerment, how y'all can be better in the empowerment space, I think is what I want to leave with my last comment.
And if I could just add,
yeah, please
add a little part as a programmer and person on the ground, those private dollars allow me to do way more than those federal dollars, because
That's right.
there's so many restrictions on.
That's right.
So, for example, EPA was one of the offices under EPA was in our park having their little employee day, and they were like, yeah, and there's all this money, all this money, and we looked up the requirements and the work, and we were like. So it's just like, although that money's out there, some of that looks like it's in a foreign language to us. As bad as we want it, as big as that ticket is, it would be incredibly helpful if there was some sort of way that we could use your infrastructure to kind of help make that make sense, but then also couple that with those private dollars, because a lot of times these people need to be fed. A lot of times people need transportation to these places. So I think it's a perfect combination to be very strategic about how to layer those together. Because I'd love to figure out how to get in those funding federal pockets. My God.
And let me just add quickly before Melissa rounds us out. General support grant making, general support grants are empowering grants, right? That's the money that I gave at the Ford Foundation. Everybody else was funding Harvard University, this, that, and the other, and and all these great exploratory things and intellectual pursuits. And I was giving people general support money, so one, they could pay themselves, they could have health insurance, they could have paid vacation, they could other things, they could hire an accountant or a CPA to manage their resources. People really need those basic investments in their organizations. And before they can attract that other capital, they have to build that capacity of their organizations. I think folks have been dropping that in the chat. Ann Mills dropped that in the chat. But think about the power of giving general support and general operating grants that can then leverage this other resource. But if they don't have the most basic components together, they're not going to be able to get in this game. And it would be criminal with all this money flowing if the people who the money is directed for are not able to access it and pull it down.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Vernice. I'm now going to hand it over to Casey to close things out and talk about next steps.
Great. Hi, all. So I just wanted to first say thank you to Vernice and Sacoby and Akiima and Melissa for their time today. I hope everyone can join me in thanking them. As you might imagine from their presentations, they're really busy. And we're deeply, deeply lucky for their time. And so I appreciate all of you so much. Thank you so much for your time today. And for your incredible, thoughtful, and very candid presentations. So this was obviously wonderful. There was a lot of great discussion in the chat, a lot of questions. I think folks may want to stay on the call. If you do choose to stay on the call to ask questions with anyone, please feel free. Noelle said she might stay on for a little bit, so we'll leave the Zoom room open. Next steps. So obviously there's a lot of opportunity. I was actually sending emails on this call, right? But I think that there's a tentative plan to meet later in March for some of the funders to continue this conversation and make sure that we go through this chat, go through what we heard and talk about what it is that we can do in response to what we're being asked for here and not let this just drop, right? As a conversation, we're listening and we want to actually be responsive to what's being said in the call today. So I also wanted to thank Mo and Local Concepts and Jamie for helping to plan today. This was something that doesn't, these things don't come about by magic. And so there's some people working behind the scenes to organize this, and I appreciate their time so much too. I guess I will just say, again, thank you to Noelle too. I didn't want to leave her just because she wasn't on this last panel. I didn't want to leave you out. Thank you so much for your time, Noelle, today too. And with that, I'll pass it back to Christy and Sonia if you wanted to add anything before we wrap up.
Oh, thanks. I just wanted to show you what I was drawing, Vernice. There's an image that emerged of you and your partner standing out on the street holding hands together. And then the heart emerged there. And then I've just been taking notes, capturing all these just amazing, powerful words that the panelists have been sharing. So I will summarize my visualization for this group and send it out in the notes.
And there's a link to the survey in the chat. Yeah, so if folks haven't looked in the chat, please go ahead and look at that. The survey link will be shared there. And we'll also send maybe a follow-up email as well. So we welcome feedback, questions, to inform our next steps too. So thank you for the feedback too. Thank you all so much for being here today. It was good to see everyone's faces.
Thank you. Thank you for putting this on.
Y'all take care.
Thanks
Great
all. Take
information.
care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
That was awesome.
It was